Okay, yes, it's recording. Okay, welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangl, and I will be today's moderator. More importantly, today's speaker will be Veronica Tozzi-Thompson with the topic Trust, Testimony, and the Epistemic Value of Historical Narrative. Veronica is Associate Professor of Philosophy of History at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And she is also superior researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technological Research of Argentina. Her main research interests lie in pragmatist philosophy of history, narrativism, and here especially Hayden White. I think she's one of the foremost experts around the globe on Hayden White's work, and also on the epistemology of testimony. Now, of Veronica's very many publications in English and Spanish, I want to mention only a few here that have direct bearing on today's topic. For once, we have, she published The Epistemic and Moral Role of Testimony, which was published in 2012 in History and Theory. Then in 2018, she published the text, A Pragmatist View of Two Accounts of the Nature of Our Connection with the Past, Hayden White and David Carr 30 years later, which appeared in Rethinking History. And then there's also a forthcoming text that is of relevance for us, which is called Epistemologies of Memory and History, which is forthcoming in the Oxford Handbook of History and Memory. And this text, I'm not sure when it's forthcoming, but we can all look forward to, maybe as a Christmas present, maybe after. Veronica will be able to tell us. This is the fourth and penultimate event of our autumn seminar of the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. After today, we will still have Yasin Ramazan from Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey, speaking on December 19 about history of nature and medieval Islamic thought. And this talk will also be on YouTube, on Zoom, and later on, hopefully also on YouTube, like here. And since our motto is after the seminar is before the seminar, we already now started planning our spring seminar, but there are still open slots. So if you or anybody else would like to talk in our spring seminar anytime from February and June, between February and June, please let us know. Now, if you want to stay updated about the Center of Philosophical Studies of History's activities, please consider following our social media. We have Facebook and X, formerly Twitter, and we are also about to migrate to Blue Sky. So you will hopefully find us there soon too. Now, before I give the word to Veronica, just a few technicalities. Please mute yourself during Veronica's talk to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. And after the talk, which I think will take something like 40 minutes, there will be a discussion session that I will moderate. In the discussion session, if you have a question or comment, please first indicate so in the chat. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn, you can either speak with or without your camera on, or you can type your question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud. And we will prioritize people who haven't spoken yet, so they will move up the speakers list. That was it from me. Thank you very much for all of you being here, and especially for Veronica. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, for sharing my work in progress with you, with the Center for Philosophy Studies of History. I think you are a very good and important audience for me, or to me. So, well, I will present a PowerPoint in order to help my speaking. In the following, I will share my PowerPoint. It's here. Well, in the following words, I try to give some answers to several objections against narrativism. I think the new epistemology of testimony could be helpful. I think that. Well, a narrativist philosophy of history pointed out on the limitations of relying solely on strictly epistemic considerations to evaluate historical narratives, rather than assessing narratives of the past only based on their compatibility with empirical evidence, which is often perceived as theoretically neutral and devoid of moral values. Narrativism urges a broader perspective. This is because, on the one hand, there is no value-neutral or literal way of describing or classifying people and their behavior. On the other hand, following and unhacking, there is the looping effect between kinds of people and the people classified. Now, being aware of the lack of fixedness and the disputability of the concepts and classifications that constitute such descriptions, epistemology of historiographical research should pay attention to the constitution of communal epistemic agreements around these concepts, as well as the social implications that the use and public circulation of these concepts may entail. That issue is one of the reasons why narrativism found an important ally in various constructivist theories of linguistic meaning, what is generally and really called the linguistic term. But it also wants us to what extent historical controversies about the past are disputes about epistemic authority over language and concepts for speaking about and describing people. We owe ourselves the opportunity to think about the complexities of factual description and White's intellectual legacy for epistemology and the philosophy of history. To appreciate the significance of adopting a constructivist account of historical language, it is essential to review the works of philosophers on the complexities of description in general and on description of historical events in particular. An interesting precedent is provided by Karl Popper regarding the use of universal concepts to describe empirical singular events. He argues that a statement like, "Here is a glass of water," employs universal concepts that cannot be directly correlated with any specific sense experience. These concepts presuppose laws that would also need to be corroborated so that the basic statement to be accepted. But this would lead to an infinite regress. Therefore, quote Popper, basic statements are accepted as the result of a decision or agreement, and to that extent, they are conventions. End of quote. In this sense, there is an epistemic decision-making process regarding such statements based on community agreement within the scientific community. Hayden White's specific contribution to the peculiarities of historical descriptions revolves around questioning a sharp distinction between literal language and figurative language. However, it is crucial to appreciate White's account as another step in the long history of reflections on this topic since the 19th century. I don't do a long history of these topics, so only a few steps. A first consideration notes that as a social or humanistic discipline, historical research deals with collective and individual human actions, praying, greetings, murdering, demonstrations, wars, etc. And unlike mere events like tides, eclipses, rain, are described and understood in terms of meanings, interests, reasons, motives, goals, desires to act, that is, in terms of intentionality. Intentional vocabulary involves normativity, and as a consequence, it complicates the sharp distinction between description and evaluation. An additional consideration arises in relation to the application of the adjective historical, since we are not simply referring to something that happened in the past, but rather we are describing the event after its occurrence from an external or even an accessible perspective for the protagonist. Arthur Danto introduces the expression narrative sentences in order to give a precise account of historical language. One more step. Louis Mink went beyond Danto and claimed that narrative centers express not only a temporal but also a conceptual asymmetry. But the road does not end yet. These descriptions and redescriptions are integrated within a conceptual framework, narrative configuration. Therefore, the presumption of events without description as the basis of historical knowledge is not tenable. Now, it's time for Hayden White. The traditional distinction between form and context in historical discourse, where facts are seen as the body of historical discourse and style as its clothing, becomes problematic in the absence of a clear criterion for distinguishing between the literal and the figurative. Then, quote White, the analyst of historical discourse can perceive the extent to which historical discourse constructs its subject matter in the very process of speaking about it. End of quote. The last step for now is Ian Hacking, who encapsulates all the complexities of description in social and historical discourse, used as well by health sciences and biological sciences, with the idea of the looping effect, or kinds of people, or humankinds. The use of classificatory concepts of people, worker, slave, criminal, homosexual, autistic, child abuse, author, Zulu, woman refugee, genius, anorexic, all concepts that Hacking study, interact with the people to whom such concepts are applied. New knowledge about the criminal or the homosexuality becomes known to the people classified and change the way that these individuals behave, and loops back to force changes in the classifications and knowledge about them. Perhaps people recognize and accept the classification and consider themselves as belonging to it, or they reject the classification altogether. All our actions are subject to descriptions, and the actions we can carry out in our context, war, or particular situation depend on the descriptions available to us. Moreover, classifications, says Hacking, do not exist solely in the empty space of language or in the mind, but in institutions, practices, material interactions with things and with other people. The classifications of social sciences are interactive. Interactive kind is the name given by Hacking. All these critical considerations about what is involved in describing past actions and events call into question the belief in a fixed past or in past events without description as the foundation of historical knowledge. However, it is extremely important to make it clear that from here it does not follow, according to my reasoning, that historical descriptions cannot be epistemically evaluated. On the contrary, it underscores the unavoidable retrospective nature of historical knowledge, where the criteria for justifying descriptions are dictated by the historians present. This present also underpins conceptual disagreements regarding kinds of people and the legitimacy of their application. Besides, the legitimacy of humankind is not of the exclusive authority of historiography. Academia is often challenged by the broader community in the same way that historiography itself challenges certain historical accounts in the public sphere. It is revealed here that deep disagreements about the past can be understood as disputes over epistemic authority, who is entitled to provide reliable and socially acceptable accounts of the past. White has criticized historians who claim to hold the epistemic authority over the historical past because they only follow the rules of evidence, as well as hold the advantage of the retrospective view, funding an ethically questionable attitude in this historian's claim. Let me show you. White in a text from 2000, but it was unpublished and included in the Ethics of Narrative, says, to adopt a epistemological perspective in the present to address past events implies a choice of previous perspective about such events as precursors of own. This election, based on this presumed epistemic advantage, at the same time exalts an entity preceding it as its own precursor and derogates it as an imperfect or partial or incomplete protomorph of itself. I will attempt to analyze these thoughts critically in terms of the epistemology of testimony. But first, it is important to present some main points about epistemology of testimony. Epistemology of testimony is the branch of epistemology that studies the possibility of justifying our beliefs in the external world, other minds, oneself, or the past, based on others' words. In social life or in professional or academic life, very few things we know from our own experience or reasoning. As Hume himself pointed out, almost everything we know about everyday occurrences, history, science, our families, or even ourselves, like our every childhood, we know because somebody told us in spoken or written words. Historians, scientists, friends, relatives, teachers, and so on, whom we trust and treat as authorities on these matters. As a result, the question of justifying knowledge acquired from the word of others, second-hand knowledge, arises. The disputes center on who bears epistemic responsibility for assertions and beliefs, the witness or the believer, the speaker or the audience. According to Benjamin McMillan, there are two alternatives. One, to continue the legacy of modern epistemology and its Cartesian ideal of the individual's epistemic autonomy. That is, an ahistorical and social account of a human being who follows her own reason or experience and doubts others' words, teaching, and reports. The other, epistemic dependency, largely the result of developments from the last century in social epistemology, sociology of knowledge, feminist epistemology, social history of science, sustains that the very notion of knowledge is appreciated as a collective good, collectively produced and reproduced. Quote Stephen Shaping, in securing our knowledge, we rely upon others, and we cannot dispense with that reliance. End of quote. The question of the place of testimony in historiography has been addressed in accordance with the ideal of epistemic autonomy, that is, in analogy with the evaluation of evidence in any science, and in terms of the lay-expert relationship in analogy with the logic of the witness in court or trial. When accepting a testimonial report, the historian must make a judgment about the plausibility of the testified fact, but also about the credibility of the witness. I am aware that for the historian, epistemic autonomy is an important value, especially when assessing the reports of witnesses who are no longer present. But what remains invisible here is that to perform their critical autonomy in a specific case, historians themselves have relied on the written or oral word of experts from their own epistemic community. The expression historical evidence encapsulates complex processes of working with materials, technicals, as well as assessing the credibility of witness testimonies. The accomplishment of this process requires to perform various skills from diverse areas of expertise that not only are not necessarily concentrated in a single individual, but also it is not required that the historian personally review every step of the process before accepting the evidence. Historiographical practice, like any social practice, occurs within the framework of a distribution of roles and delegation of trust in experts. For the historian, it is sufficient to legitimize their appeal to evidence in support of their narrative or interpretation of events by deferring the validity of that evidence to the judgment of experts. The point to note here is that in the standard description of the validation process, there is not always reference to this web of trust and delegation of authority. Rather, it emphasizes the historian's autonomy who has subjected their interpretation to rigorous roles of evidence, positioning themselves as the spokespersons for the truth about the past. In his studies on the rise of experimental science and the figure of the experimental scientist or the natural philosopher in 19th century England, the historian of science, Stephen Shapin, characterizes this process as the co-production of the order of knowledge and the social order. He says, in producing theories, in our case, historical interpretations, historical narratives, the determination of who the reliable epistemic agents are entitled to present the truth is also established. These thoughts lead to, according to my point of view, a non-reductionist and interpersonal approach to the epistemology of testimony, aiming to elucidate the constituent roles of trust, authority, believing in the word of others, and being believed by others in both common sense knowledge and the knowledge produced by expert communities. Mackmyler characterizes the justificatory role that interpersonal relations play in the production of knowledge with the expression epistemic dependence on others. In his own words, what characterizes second-hand or testimonial knowledge is that, quote, mature epistemic agents under a standing obligation to respond to relevant epistemic challenges to what they believe are entitled to defer relevant challenges back to the original speaker. End of quote. As a serious consequence, in the constitution of any area of knowledge, it is necessary to identify who are those reliable agents and who are excluded from dishonor. To suffer the dishonor or not being believed could imply an epistemic injustice, like Miranda Fricker pointed out, the situation of harming someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. These considerations have significant implications for the epistemology of history. Not only, according to my view, as we have done so far, accounting for the fact that the epistemic evaluation historians make of historical testimony and evidence is dependent on interactions within their academic community in terms of trust and authority, but also it provides us with an epistemic framework to address, without despair or succumbing to skepticism and relativism, the concrete fact of our times where the epistemic authority of academic history is being challenged by the emergence of new subjects, new voices that demand inclusion in history or to be authors of history through various forms of activism. I include here, for example, those new subjects, young men around between 18 years old and 25 years old, poor mostly, that find in leaders like Trump or Milei in my own country the representations of their necessities, no? And know in the progressive perspectives, perhaps that that happened before, no? That is another preoccupation. In summary, the thoughts presented in this section warns us that the epistemic evaluation of historical narratives or historical accounts must take into account the interaction between disciplinary practice and those external and lay voices who demand not to be excluded from the community or reliable people. What remains to be shown is how the interpersonal epistemology of testimony sheds light on this interaction. To do this, we must connect the reflections from section 2 with those from sections 1. The epistemic value of narrative, I will try to, that is my proposal, no? It is to offer an account about the epistemic value of narrative accounts of the past. Miranda Fricker has called epistemic injustice to the situation of harming someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. Fricker points out 2 cases of epistemic injustice based on identity prejudice or due an unequal distribution of interpretative resources. This could give the impression that it would be support arguments for a definitive ethical term, given the political and moral dimension of discrediting, and a secondary appreciation of epistemology, or it's a final epistemology in ultimate instance depends on ethical issues. But I think it would be a misguided consequence. A person can suffer all kinds of harm due to identity-based prejudices, including physical violence and death. However, their testimony, even we or the historian or the intellectuals can regard their desires, interests, and needs, they can be disregarded without necessarily suffering physical violence. We still believe that they need our expert knowledge to improve their conditions. It is time to analyze what epistemic harm might consist of in the disciplinary practice of historiographical research. Well, this is my last point. Building on the observations made in section 1, academic historiography is constantly challenged by various marginalized groups, not so much regarding the facts of the past, but around how we talk about those facts and how historiographical narratives classify and describe, for example, women, the inhabitants of former colonies, and the indigenous peoples, previously referred to as Indians. For example, in my country, the narratives in dispute about the constitution of the nation during the 19th century are named by the conquest of the desert, because Argentina used to be a desert, because there are not civilization before the Spanish came here, and it was populated by the savage Indians in a state who lived in a state of nature, or an alternative historical narrative named the process like indigenous genocide. I noted the disputability of descriptions and classifications in the social and human sciences arise from the fact that there is no neutral or literal way to describe or classify people and their behavior, as well as from the looping effect identified by Hakim. Consequently, the interactive dimension of these classifications, I think, blurs without eliminating the boundaries between disciplines and cultural practices, and between all kinds of cultural practices, no? And between experts and lay people, thereby altering and redescribing the very narrative that historians and scholars construct about their discipline. My point: interpersonal epistemology of testimony does not discredit the genuine critical activity that historians carry out when evaluating the relevance or reliability of testimonies according to their own criteria or the criteria of the expert community. But this critical activity is not performed without presuppositions from the point of nowhere, like Thomas Nagel used to say in the point who might be to, I can't remember the name, who is like to be a bat. Well, on the contrary, knowing things through others' words is a basic fact of life. Criticism, doubt, or personal evaluation of others' beliefs are secondary phenomena. They happen against the background of communities of trust, that is, epistemic, communities of membership. Well, let me put in this way. That is my last my proposal. I think the plausibility of this proposal needs many examples. That is my work, but I don't share this work now. I only share the conceptual points. When considering the academic duty to pay attention to the non-academic voices of perspectives of victims of genocides, discrimination on the basis of race, gender, or sex, totalitarian regimes, colonialism, and exploitation is only moral in nature and not epistemic, we are depriving them of their capacity as knowers. We are committing an epistemic injustice. In conclusion, when historiography seeks to produce historical narratives that incorporate subalternized perspectives, it also commits to being attentive to avoid narrative figurations that derogate the epistemic value of those voices, expanding the epistemic community, the network of trust and authority. Ultimately, the search for new and more inclusive historical narratives should lead to rewrite the narrative of their own epistemic community. Well, thank you very much for your patience, and I finish. So
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Veronica. Right. So we are now then in the discussion session. Is there, who wants to go first? Question, comments, concerns?
Clarifications.
Clarifications, of course. I think Yulita had raised her hand, right? Please.
Yeah,
Yes.
hello. Thank you for the talk. I guess I will speak on the unprofessional side because I think history is kind of very a thankful field for that, because there are lots of people who pay enough attention to it as a hobby. At least from my experience, I live in Lithuania, and there are many people who are really interested in history of Lithuania, of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and all of that stuff. So they usually, and just listening to your talk, to your speech, I was wondering, what would you say about the possibility of competing narratives, about different testimonies taking place at the same time, and the possibility of them competing? And this I bring directly from commentary on people who just read history for their own pleasure. Almost everyone would say that they read everything that is being written on the topic, even though they are different paths of explanation. They are different versions of the same event, and they read those different versions, and they kind of try to shape a middle way, like a moderate account. Or in the end, they say that they do not really know what to think about it. It's enough that you kind of cover a lot of the ground, and that's that. You're kind of left with equal conclusions. So no determinant conclusions are there. So that's what I've been talking about, just people who are not professional historian. So I think that's quite interesting. And then another question, a bit hypothetical, I guess, would be what would you say is the ideal outcome after, like, how should this ideal acknowledgement of somebody's testimony look like? And then just for the reference, I think your problem said that the last conclusions, they refer a little bit to the field of cultural studies, cultural sciences, and there are certain names like Stuart Hall and Edward Thompson, I think, that would be maybe useful for you to develop like further along, because they would be the people who would claim that this question of acknowledging like minorities and somebody's ability to know and testify, they kind of already enter into the field of cultural science rather than philosophy of history. So maybe you're crossing the disciplinary boundary here. I don't know. That's just some thoughts for me. Thank you.
No, I will speak about 2 points about your observations. The first one is about people, non-professional people who read different perspectives and only for entertainment. That is yes, I understand that, but perhaps in that case, there is not an epistemic issue, because I am trying to first of all, the background of this is that narrativism is anti-epistemological, and perhaps we should abandon narrativism because it's only about different perspectives, literary ways of speaking about the past, etc., etc. But at least in my country, the problem with the history of the 19th century has consequences in the present times, no, for all the people in my country. It's not something, yes, first of all, I read history because I enjoy reading history. That is a situation. But but in my country, or in many countries, history is disputed in epistemic terms, not only in the academy, but in the public sphere, no, for common people. So that is the context of my view, trying to defend the epistemic value of narratives, historical narratives, the historiographic narratives, but in relationship to the social circulation of these narratives. Because, in fact, in many Latin American countries, historians are not in some not public sphere. Many of them are activists, they are involved in political issues. And for example, in my country, history, research of history, academia, depends on the public fundings. So because the universities are public, so we are, well, historians, because I'm not a historian, depends on the reception of the public about their own accounts. And why? Because those historiographical accounts have consequences in in the law, for example. But I don't know if I answer to your questions, but I will take notes about your recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. We got now two people in line. First, it's Jonas, and then it's Joni Matti. And if anybody else wants to speak, please make yourself known too.
Yeah, hey, Veronica, very much. Thanks for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot. My question is about just one specific aspect of it. It was a very rich talk, so I'm not going to address all of the ideas that came up. And this is about what you think about the difference it makes for the relation between historiography and testimony and trust. From the fact that that history is an argumentative practice. Because, for example, you spoke about interpersonal testimony, and the philosophers you talked about, for instance, Benjamin McMillan, belongs to the school of sort of the interpersonal view of testimony, and a lot of the examples they use for testimonial knowledge are sort of speech acts of telling or assertion. So, for example, a typical example in Benjamin McMillan's book is that someone is asking for road directions, or someone is telling someone else the road directions, and they accept this on trust, so to speak. And there's a transmission of knowledge or a transmission of justification by way of this. But for example, if you look at the at history as an argumentative practice, then, for instance, the historian's relation to their community is not one in which there's a mere exchange of tellings or assertions. It's a practice of argumentation, and so it's not. So that I would say is fundamentally different, because if I say, for example, that this seems like a plausible account of, say, the events of the Finnish Civil War, it's a particular case that we have a testimony about this, then I'm not simply asserting this to a colleague in an argumentation, but I'm saying that, well, I'm putting forth an argument, and arguments are not something that we accept on trust, but we accept them based on their being sort of reasonable, or that you're making a good case, for example, that you should also look at all of the evidence, and I'm presenting an argument, and if you reason as I do from this material or this evidence, then you will come to the same conclusion as I have. So it's not something that you need to accept on trust, for example. And this is, I would say, specifically in relation to the community of historians. So I was thinking about this. I'm not denying sort of the basic fact that we also depend on the word of others constantly in our knowledge about the world, but it seems to be that the community of historical research, the community of historians, is an argumentative practice, sort of in essence an argumentative practice. So it's a very particular kind of community compared to the situation of an everyday case of interpersonal telling or assertion. So I was wondering what you think about this, sort of the specific nature of historiography from this perspective.
Yes, I will try to answer because Jonas, our conversation in Lisbon was very important to me to re-describe my talk. 2 points. I know the difference between Mahler says, establishes between telling and argumentative. Yes, because many people of my team is here, and we discussed that issue yesterday. I think, first of all, when you, of course, history is an argumentative practice. But when you follow all the steps in the argument, in the premises, if you accept this vocabulary, not all the premises are checked by the historian himself. For example, if somebody asks you, why do you accept this document? Well, because this document was checked by some laboratory, and it's accepted in the community that laboratory is a place to trust. And why? Why do you accept that laboratory or that archive is trustful? Because perhaps your teacher or your colleagues told you. That is the example. Or perhaps I use some points of Mac-Miller because the thing that I am interested in Mac-Miller is the right to defer the authority. All of us as human beings are entitled to defer the authority or the responsibility, the epistemic responsibility in some of our beliefs in order to proceed to resolve specific problems. If I am involved in a problem, research problem in historical research, well, I am entitled to defer some the responsibility, the epistemic responsibility to some technicians or experts and to my teachers that told me that those are the places for sending the checking. But so I am in fact, I follow more Stephen Shapin than Mac-Miller, no? When Stephen Shapin describes the process of experiment in a lab in terms of this deferring of authority. If you, as a scientist, want to check all the steps in the checking, even the materials, the substance, the electricity, etc., well, you never involve yourself in process of investigation. That is the point. I'm not saying that history is not argumentative, but the point, the specific point here is for historians or for academic history, when when we are talking about people, for example, original indigenous people. In Finland, in Sweden, you have original people as well, and have the same problem like here, no, with the people Sami. It's called. Well, doesn't matter. Here, for example, new historians, the new generations of historians think about indigenous people as knowers, not only as savages victims. They take in account seriously their knowledge, their knowledge, and in fact, we have not a lot, but we have some subjects in Argentina where the community, the scientific community, include not only academic historians, but people from the communities to rethink the events in the past. I don't know if I answered.
Thanks a lot. Just a brief reply. I was thinking about just, I would agree with this, that there's this sort of fundamental dependence if one thinks about sort of the infrastructure of how historical knowledge is produced, for example, that we place our trust in that the archives they are not sort of fabrications or somebody has been tampering with the material or something like that, and that we rely on previous research. But that is, of course, also something that can be questioned all of the time in arguments by historian. And a central part of research practice is to question, of course, what previous research has claimed. But I was thinking about simply sort of the relationship to testimony, for example, in historical research compared with interpersonal relations. For in an interpersonal relationship, the deferral of responsibility can be sort of justified by my relation to that person who has asserted something. So if my friend says something, then I accept what he says, sort of because of our relationship. There is no doubt to be defeated, so to speak, because we are in an interpersonal relationship. So my reason for accepting the claim is that I am in this relationship. But that's very different in historical research, because I can't, so to speak, defer my responsibility for accepting a claim, for example, to my personal relationship to the person who has claimed it. But I have to provide reasons for why it would be reasonable for just anyone who is engaging in historical research to accept such a claim. So there seems to be a different logic of justification for claims in historiography than there is in an interpersonal relationship, where something can sort of the chain of justification can end simply by one person having a relationship to another person, and having this then that they are in a relationship of trust. So there is no doubt to be defeated, so to speak. But in a sense, I would say it is of course wrong to say that historians doubt everything. But it is an argumentative practice in which critique and justification, further justification, is always invited in a way that it's not in an interpersonal relationship. So in that sense, I would say that one need to be careful that one doesn't make the interpersonal case and the historiographic case too similar. So.
Yes, I think we can follow the discussion many times, but I think we academics belong to a community that is a community with interpersonal relationships. No, that is first. I think the exit, no, el éxito, no me acuerdo cómo se dice, the plausibility of my approach depends on first understanding the relationships among the community. That is the important thing, because in a scientific community, success, thank you, Andrea, if we don't agree, or if we don't understand that our community is an interpersonal community, or not necessarily all the people in the community are in the same close relationship, but our work in specific research problems is carried out for a community, an interpersonal community. So that is the point. Historians have among them interpersonal relationships. And they are entitled, that is my point. Even when what comes first? The doubt, like in a pragmatist approach, no, like John Dewey or Mead or William James or Peirce. What comes first, the doubt or the belief? Well, we believe with in some issues, as meanwhile nothing defy our beliefs. So that is the reasoning for myself. If we understand that the historiographical community, the historiographic community, the community of historians are or consist in different small communities of specialists who work in interpersonal relationship. Well, they don't defy all the beliefs of their colleagues. They work together in different roles, different relationships of trust. That is the point. I don't know if perhaps I repeat my thought.
Yeah, no, thanks. I will. Thanks a lot. I think we can continue this another time, but there are many people here who want to.
We might come back in the end if there's time, if you want to really. But next is Joni-Matti. Then I would also have a question, but if somebody else wants to go first, also they can speak up. So first, Joni-Matti.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for the very good talk. I'm not vested as much as you two in this literature, but I probably continue the topic anyway from slightly different perspective. But before that, a small question, maybe answer is long, but I was just wondering, why do you use the term epistemic injustice rather than epistemically, for example, unjustified? So it's such as something, a moral dimension. But that's just a small question, maybe a big answer. But I go to my
epistemic justice or
epistemically unjustified, because that would be like normal epistemological notion. But you have injustice, and I understand it has a moral dimension. So like something like not being fair or unfair, unfairness or something like that. Just a small terminological thing. But then I was also wondering about the role of testimony in knowledge in historiography, mainly because I also have this understanding of testimonial knowledge that it is interpersonal knowledge, often relies on a person's testimony, person saying or stating something like, my example, how could I know as a Finnish person that there are large animals, gray big animals with a long trunk, like elephants? Okay. In the previous times, I couldn't have known unless someone visited and told me, okay, there are such things, and now I trust this person's testimony. You know, such a thing exists. We don't see them here. So that's a sort of clear case. To me, it sounds. But is there anything like that, a role of anything like that in historiography? And mainly I'm thinking, what is the nature of historical knowledge or knowledge in historiography? And if we accept that it's something like narratives or collegations or indeed argumentations or arguments, I don't know who, is there anybody who can sort of witness or say testimony a thing about that? Because it seems to be that it's just the mechanism or way to construct is just so different. Rather than seeing an object like an elephant, now I colligate something like the Renaissance, or that the march towards the First World War was like sleepwalking or anything like that. So those are just examples. So if that's significant element of historiographical knowledge, how does testimony fit in that picture? And in that sense, I would see it with very limited role, because indeed, how to explain that whether sleepwalking thesis or the idea about the Renaissance, how it's justified. And where I agree with you and with many others is, of course, it's a community, and it's, of course, interpersonal relations. But isn't it rather than there is a community based on some values, on some practices, and based on some values, and whether it's justification there is, it emerges from the sort of the communal basis or communal roots. Do you see what I mean?
No, the last sentence, Wallis, I don't understand what is.
Well, the main question is indeed whether whether historical knowledge is something very different from a normal observational or testimonial situation, like colligations, narratives, and argumentations. So whose testimony, how can there be a testimony of those kind of things? And then whose testimony we can rely on or trust, and in what way, and even why? Or is there something wrong in my outlining the situation?
I don't know if I have the answer. Why I use epistemic injustice is because I take the expression from Miranda Fricker, no? That is the only reason. When at first point, I don't know if I answer the thing. The process of knowledge is, under this perspective, moral and epistemic. There are no moral or epistemic. No, that is the reason. But if I understand your question, you ask. No, I don't understand who are the. Could you repeat? Sorry, could you repeat the last question?
Well, it's just a long question. It's just all of it was description of my question. So, I mean, how can there be testimonial knowledge of anything like a colligation or colligatory information or narratives or argumentation? Because it's not like someone giving a testimony of an observational thing or something that could have been witnessed. It's a constructed, and it seems that the mechanism is rather different. So,
for example, yes, you think there is a difference between to report some event, and report some interpretation. That is the first. To take the words of father about there was an elephant, or take the words of father about the Renaissance.
Right, but that could be possibly one way to put it. But then report of an interpretation. But does it mean that, let's say, Christopher Clark is a historian who suggested that the march towards the First World War was like sleepwalking? It's an interpretation. So is his interpretation based on testimony, or is it rather that someone now relies on the testimony of Christopher Clark? But why should we do that?
I don't know if I can analyze with your words. For me, the interest of that kind of the interest of analyzing the work of the book of Clarke, Sleepwalkers. I think.
Sleepwalk. Yeah.
Because I read your article and your. Well, my interest in analyzing that book under the light of the epistemology of testimony is if when he analyzed that event in the past, following that or under some theoretical approach, perhaps he tried to add other perspectives from different demands in his present. For example, you can approach an event in the past from the perspective of the businessmen, of workers, or you can add the gender perspective or the colonization perspective, and in that case, perhaps he add those different perspectives because he accepted trust in the people, perhaps colleagues from him, women or people from the third world, and he tried to, for accepting their testimony, he rewrite or rethink the event. That is the point.
Does it entail then that when Christopher Clarke wrote this book and he ended up with the thesis of sleepwalking, the sleepwalking thesis itself emerges from testimonies of people?
Yes.
Okay, that's a very kind of anti-narrativist thesis, because it's a kind of, the idea that you don't, the history is not written, or it doesn't emerge directly from the evidence or traces or the data, but actually there's a subjective or constructive element, and you sort of colligate and put them together. So therefore, I don't see the role so clearly. Of course, it could be, I'm just speculating, it could be that we identify this particular historian, Christopher Clarke, being such a good interpreter that therefore we can trust his interpretative skills. But would seem to me a quite of extension of a testimonial. But this is all I can
Perhaps the epistemology of testimony is worried, without denying the value of Clarke, analyze what words or what perspectives are invisibilized in the book. That is the problem in the history of science, no? And in the history of science, for example, the book of Shaping, because I didn't read the book of, in the book of Shaping, he says that in 19th century, a figure, the gentleman, constitutes that like the spokesperson of truth, invisibilizing all the people that working on were working on the production of the vacuum pump, and all the people that were excluded of working on science, like women or Black people, etc., etc. That is the important thing on epistemology of testimony. It's not against argumentation, research, etc. In my view, is a warning that we have to be clear that in our own community, community of experts, perhaps when we narrate or explain or interpret the past, we are excluding perspectives or practices, etc., etc. That
Okay.
is the point.
This is my final comment. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So if I understand it now correctly, and it was very helpful when you used Stephen Shapin's this example, it sounds to me that it's not even about the justification, but it's indeed about injustice or, epistemic injustice, because in his case, that gentleman was the only trustworthy person to say about the nature, because that's how it was. But it's not a justified. It's just, it has to do with the social role, social distribution of witnesses or knowers in the society. But of course, it can't be that only a gentleman can be now or even then, that only a gentleman can be a reliable witness. So it doesn't have to do with justification at all. It's rather unjustified.
It's justification instead of what?
Well, relying on power relations, social roles of who is taken as trustworthy witness, because it sounds to me that if you identify Stephen Shaping in the 17th century England, a gentleman as a trustworthy witness, the only one, not the peasant, not the woman, and so on, not the servant. It's not the road to justification of knowledge. It's just a description of the social constellation at the time of knowledge production.
Yes, I think fortunately, I can listen to the talk again and take the comments with the recording version. But I think, yes, Shaping is talking about the production of knowledge, no, the whole process, not discovering and justification, no, the production of knowledge.
Yeah.
And perhaps with, but I sustain that is the whole production, the whole process, who are entitled to spoke about the truth because is a reliable person, but the standard description of that is not because he is a reliable person. The standard description, the standard philosophy description of research investigation is because each scientist himself or herself prove their assertions, corroborated their assertions with the evidence. That is the important thing, because there is a standard description that describe the scientist practice, historiographical practice, etc., like if any individual by himself makes the process of contrasting or proving, or can make the process individually. That is the issue. And when you look at the process deeply, you find that they distribute the process. No one of them individually follow all the steps in the proving of all the premises in the argument. That is the point.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I would have a question if it is still okay. There's no other hands up. at the moment, I think, hopefully. I didn't overlook somebody. So I'll interject myself shortly, and it fits very well to what also Jonas and Yoni-Matti asked or discussed, I think. Towards the end of your talk, you said something like, it's an epistemic injustice if we don't take subaltern groups or members of subaltern groups also as knowers, and it's not just a moral injustice. And then my question is, do you mean here something like potential knowers? Because that's a bit what Yoni-Matti also says. There might be an injustice too if we discard certain groups of people, a type of testimony per se. It's like, I know, women or marginalized group X cannot give proper historiographic testimony because of their membership in a group. That would be wrong. We know that. But then they are potential knowers. But for them to be knowers in the sense of for historiography, you will still have to see whether or not their testimony holds water, if this is a good testimony. So as a type, we cannot discount certain testimony. That would be wrong. That would be a fallacy. But for any kind of token testimony, the testimony of whatever subaltern group X said, or a member of the group said, we still have to apply the critical techniques of historiography too, right? Otherwise, we're not doing our historiographic job. But then it seems like then the question that you seem to be asking is, why don't we trust certain groups per se, but we do trust historians per se, or other historians? And maybe this is an injustice in itself. But then we just have the argument that the type of testimony or the type of work that historians give, we have theoretical justification to trust other historians. We have good justification. I mean, it's their job to produce knowledge of the past. I mean, they fail in that too and so on. But we have good philosophical justification, epistemic values and whatnot, why historians usually or often succeed in their job. So in that sense, historians are giving better testimony than random member of group X, right? Ceteris paribus, everything else being equal. So therefore, we have good justification to trust in historians, even in the individual testimony, without having justified ourselves, or we have better justification than to trust in the individual testimony of a member of group X. I'm not sure if that was clear enough, but that was one point. The second point.
I think I understand.
Yes.
Yes.
I have another point too, but just very shortly. The second.
No,
do you want to answer
yes.
immediately? The second is very short. It's just I think nowadays everybody agrees that historians don't justify everything they say in a work. And maybe they say stuff that cannot be justified at all. They make moral statements. They make all kinds of crude statements, too political statements. Many of them might not have any epistemic justification whatsoever, and they cannot have epistemic justification. But I think Wolf Kannsteiner has brought up this term called proof economy somewhere in his writing. He said something like, one, of course, paper is limited and an account is limited. You can't prove everything that you would like to prove, also in footnotes and so on. And the other thing is just this pragmatic element that a certain debate is in a certain state. If I write a biography of Hitler, I don't justify anymore that he was born, I don't know, in 1889 in this border town of Austria. I don't need to do that anymore. Others have justified that before. So the limited resource that I have to justify something, I put on something that is relevant to my actual thesis. So there's the proof economy of it. So that's part of the justification as well, right? It's not just trust. It's also maybe it's an element of trust too, but what has been justified already and what is the state of the art of the debate. And only that which where I really advance my point, that would need to be justified in my own work. Does that make sense? Sorry, that's answer whichever you want or however you want.
Yes. I think in relation to the first question, why how can I decide to trust on some external voice to the academy or to the expert historian about the situation of those people? That is the question.
Yes, I mean, the question is, you said it's an epistemic injustice if we don't take members of subaltern group X as knowers. And I think, of course, they're potential knowers.
Yes.
And there's a difference.
No, okay, yes. All this approach is about rights, not facts. as an intellectual, as a researcher, I have the right to defer the authority or the responsibility about the situation of some people to the people involved in that situation. I have the right to do that. No, that is the most the recommendation of Mac-Miller, I think, is a prescription. It is a prescription. It is not a prescription in sense. No, it is not a prescription. It is a normative sentence. All of us, given that we are human beings and epistemic agents, have the right to defer the epistemic responsibility to some people we trust. It's a right, no? I can perform the right, or I can't not perform the right. In some cases, I can defer. In some others, I prefer not to put in doubt about my informers. That is the main point, because Mac-Miller is talking about human beings. Is a philosophy about who is a human person, etc., etc. In a specific case of research, scientific research, I think we don't, I'm not saying that we always, we have always, or we must always defer the authority to the external voices. In fact, that is not my point. I critique this point in my article, the History and Theory article in 2012. I am against the notion of moral witness or the epistemic privilege of the victim. I'm against that. I sustain that I recommend to be aware that sometimes we are intellectuals, we could be paternalistic. I don't know if the word exists. We could be paternalistic with the victims. You don't understand what happened to you. I know before, I know better than you. What do you need? That is the situation. For example, in my country, with the relationship between intellectuals, in some past, no, intellectuals and originary indigenous people. That is the issue. I am not saying that they are the epistemic privilege. I am saying you have to be careful when you are trying to help derogate the people as knowers or potential knowers. That is because, in fact, hacking, the notion of hacking, of interactive classifications of humankind, and, for example, another sociology, Anthony Giddens or Schutz, they say before science appeared, people describe and know about themselves. No, so any investigation must take in account that people have knowledge about them. And that is important to take. That not mean that it doesn't mean that I have to accept because they know about everything about them. But I have to think that the relationship between knowledge, expert knowledge, and common sense knowledge is more complicated than the expert is reliable and the common sense is not reliable because I don't know, because it's situated, etc., etc. Well, the second question, I own you, and I will think.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. Yes, we have some more. I would have some more, but we have some other people who want to ask, and the time is already also far. But Amanda.
Oh, okay. On one hand, there's no natural and literal way to describe or classify people and their actions in history. And on the other hand, empirical evidence is generally considered to be natural and lacking in moral claims, moral value. And in your conclusion, you say we should expanding the epistemic community and the network of trust and authority. To me, that seems a little bit hard to understand. So my question is that it seems we can't rule out the moral element of history. And if not, what role does it play in history? I mean, the morality can play in history. For example, telling about the truth, telling the truth about something is associated with moral qualities like honesty. If one bee said to other bees that there are many flowers on an island, which must be true, other bees can find it at last. But if the same thing is told by a human, maybe it is not true. This maybe is quite human. It's human nature. So in many cases, there's a moral constant. So my question is, what's the role of morality in history writing? Okay, that's my question.
Yes. Well, the notion of trust is, instead of truth as the foundation of knowledge, submits in the concepts epistemic and moral dimensions. That is the phenomenon of knowledge is for this approach, no, or for social approaches to knowledge. The social approaches to knowledge, the new social approach to knowledge sustain that knowledge is given that knowledge is a social enterprise, trust, the relationship between people who belong to that community, to that enterprise, is a relationship of trust. And to trust in somebody is in somebody's words, in somebody's beliefs, in somebody's knowledge, is moral and epistemic, because it's moral because you believe, you think that that person, that individual speaks the truth. He doesn't lie, but at the same time, you are talking about his epistemic beliefs. No, so that is difficult. No, it's difficult, but it's not difficult. It's not to try to divide or separate moral and epistemic questions. I think the mistake or I don't like the new ethical term in philosophy, in philosophy of history, and theory of history, because they erase the epistemic content of the situation. That is one of the things. But you asked another thing before about I forgot.
It's about the morality, because there's no value, no natural description, and no
neutral value and literal way of describing social, the social or the cultural or the human or the actions. That is the
Yeah, and I think this the network of trust is also has some implication about their morality. Trust is
only
yes.
sí.
Trust is about the also has the implication of if you trust someone, maybe there's no evidence. I mean, no description. It's not relevant about the truth, about the fact. It's just the trust. Maybe can be a moral implication. So I mean, if there's no description without value, so what's the morality? Can be used in, or what's the role? What is the role of morality can be used in the history writing?
Well, first of all, I think the disputes in history is not only about facts, no?
Yeah,
facts.
yeah.
It's about how describe facts. When you describe facts, it's not the same if you describe John died than instead of John was murdered, no? And that is not strictly a fact because there are different consequences if you describe John died or John was murdered, because there are different consequences, no? And that is the first thing. But I have an example, because I have about the why we need to wide the epistemic community, no? Because I think you didn't understand my point. For example, in some months ago, paleologists in South Africa discovered or presented a new interpretation about the paintings in a cave, paintings from the San population during the 19th century, a population, indigenous population, not scientific, who used to paint animals in caves. And according to the other interpretations, those paintings were completely imaginary, and they were painted because the sun did some rituals, etc., no? Because they have a mythical thinking, no? Mythical culture, pre-scientific culture. Well, new developments in cultural studies, in history, in anthropology, more in anthropology, and the discovery of the these paleologists was that there was the sun painted the animals in the cave, inspiring in fossils. They reconstructed the animal, that an extincted animal, instead of only imaging figures completely non-existent. So they discovered that the painting represented the hypothetical animal, the way of the hypothetical animal based on the fossils, rest fossils, no? So these paleologists reveal or redescribe the activity of the sun population and the individuals as precursors of paleology. Instead of thinking of the sun only as a pre-modern population, savages, he think of some population as precursor. He put sun in the history of paleology. And how he can do that? Because he worked with anthropologists who have another perspective about primitive populations, thinking of them as epistemic agents, about their beliefs as knowledge, not only mystic believers. So we have here an example of, I am telling you, new perspectives in our context, most of them from other disciplines, from, for example, anthropologists who work with non-industrial populations, with communities out of the capitalism, and they trust in those populations and redescribe their actions. In this case, the paleology found in these communities precursors, antecessors of paleology, not only mythical thinking. That is it's not only, we are not only worried about the facts. We are worried how describe people. That is the main problem, because our ways, I am talking about intellectuals, our ways of describing people can circulate in public sphere and take discriminating consequences.
Okay.
Okay, we have one more time, Jonas, and then perhaps a final round if there's a question, but first Jonas again.
Great. Thanks that I got the chance to ask another time. I think I was going to get back to the role of testimonial knowledge in historiography, and I think there's a much better case to be made for the role of trust and testimony for the relation between historians. So the historian's relation to the community of historians, or his or her present, so to speak. But I think one should distinguish that from the relation between historians and sort of witnesses of the past, those people who lived, say, 100 years ago, and said something about what they lived through. Because in the latter case, when it's the relation between the historian and witnesses of the past, there's a question arises, which very seldom arises in the epistemology of testimony, and especially in the interpersonal variant of epistemology of testimony. And that's the questions that, do the witnesses of the past know what the historian wants to know? And if they know it, do historians want to know it in the way that the witnesses do? Or are they seeking a different kind of understanding of past events than what was available to witnesses at the time? But the question is never actually raised, I think, in epistemology of testimony, because the entire discussion is about the transmission of knowledge. So the presupposition is that person A knows what person B wants to know, and how can you transfer information from person A to person B? But as I would think that one agrees that history is no sort of simple information transfer from past to present. So I think this is then sort of the fundamental question why the idea of testimonial knowledge in history is problematic. I'm actually writing about that. This is what Collingwood was after when he rejected testimony in the idea of history, that it wasn't about testimony being unreliable, but it's that historians seek a different kind of understanding of past events that wasn't available to witnesses. So, yeah, so what do you think about this particular relation between historians and witnesses of the past?
Well, in the, I don't know if in the presentation, but in my article, in the article, I will perhaps publish next year. I think on specifically this question because it's the question you asked me in Lisbon. I think we don't need to trust in witness of the past, because there is no possible of interpersonal relationship with people in the past. That doesn't exist. No, it's not. I think we, in relationship to witness of the past, we have to perform our critical autonomy. We are epistemic autonomy. We don't depend on. We don't need to trust in the witness on witness in the past, because it is. I don't need, even following Collingwood. He said, I can't trust in my own past eye. When I read, if I read something I wrote, a letter 10 years ago, I don't need to trust because it was me. I have to check what did I do, or what I wanted to say. Or I don't need in that cases to trust in that testimony, but to interpret or to understand what that testimony means, I trust in the experts or in I trust in some perspectives instead of other perspectives. Perhaps I am an hermeneutical, I like hermeneutical perspectives instead of, for example, deterministic perspectives or structuralist perspectives, etc., etc. That is the point. You always perform the epistemic autonomy in the background of a network of trust. That is the point. The only prescription is we have to be, the only prescription is this, is a pragmatist and fallibilist approach. We are not the owner of the truth. Our knowledge is fallible, so we have to be open to new perspectives, other perspectives, and because perhaps we, only for epistemic reasons, because perhaps I am, because I don't know everything, perhaps I am wrong, so I need other perspectives. I need other perspectives, so we have to be open to different approaches and take care of who are excluded of this concert of pluralism and conversation and dialogue, etc., etc. The problem perhaps today for many of us is academy. Today in academy there are many progressive or new perspectives from the colonial, post-colonialism, decolonialism, feminisms, etc., etc., etc. But we have new voices from young men in not good conditions of work, without formal conditions of working, and they represented by Donald Trump or that kind of ideas, right ideas, extreme right ideas. So that for me is the what miss with these perspectives and what miss with all the new voices we include, but we exclude something that we know. That is the point.
Right.
Okay. Thanks. Looking forward to the article.
Yes, I think these were very fitting ending words, both from Veronica and Jonas. So I suppose we are now really coming close to 2 hours already, which is great, of course, if there's a good discussion. But I think we'll end it here. So it remains for me to say thank you very much, especially to Veronica for her talk, and thank you very much for everybody else for being here and for discussing with all of us. And we reconvene on December 19 about medieval Islamic history and its philosophy. See you soon, guys.
Yeah.
Until next
Thanks.
time. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronica.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.